Ready to go? Last 3 days. Well, 3.5 days. Alright, so what have you heard? Oh, okay. What have you heard? Didn't miss your absence. Noticed. So we've heard about the mind so far. Mind versus, of course, mental basis. Mind versus physical basis. Oh, change that. After the assignment. Anyway, so mind versus the physical basis, which of course is really important. And the physical does affect our mental perception, no doubt about it. There's a constant interaction. But it's still said to be that it is mind over brain, basically. That in the end, if you train your mind appropriately, you can transform your brain. Versus your brain does not necessarily have to transform your mind. It can. Your mental consciousness can be, of course, affected by changes in your brain. But if you control your mind, if you learn to control your mind, it doesn't have to take place. So like with the Alzheimer, the nuns whose brain actually suffered from Alzheimer, I mean the symptoms were all there, or what would you call it? Their brain looked like a person who had Alzheimer, but it didn't manifest in their mental capacity or in their behavior. Anyway, so therefore there's a difference between the two. The mind is an incredibly powerful tool. And of course, to really utilize this tool, that's the whole purpose of Buddhist practice, to utilize it in a positive way. We need to first learn what is the mind, what is consciousness. And most of Buddhist studies, directly or indirectly, is a study of the mind. It's a study of our psyche, of our psychological makeup, if you like. And basically, I believe any problem we have, we can find the solution in the Dharma. But we need some basis, we need some solid basis. So with certain mental issues, I'm not sure the Dharma in itself will be able to help that person. That's where monopsychology comes in. For some people to hear the self-cherishing is responsible, the self-grasping can be so overwhelming that they don't want to move in that direction. If they have very low self-esteem, for instance, I'm not sure how helpful that is. So this is where it's so important to bring psychology, monopsychology, and Buddhism together, so that it can be effective. And again, there's no need for anyone to become Buddhist, but it's all about using Buddhism and bringing them into one's own life to, of course, work with the mind to reduce at least problems and possibly totally eliminate them. So, but like I said, in order to do so, what is the mind? How does it work? To understand it as an experiencing entity, an apprehending or perceiving entity. Things appear to it, things are known. So from that perspective, the mind does certain things, it engages in actions, it performs a function, and it does so with an object, which is why there's a lot of analysis, there's a lot of examination of what are the objects of mind, how do these objects appear. So we distinguish between a mind that is a correct mind, a mind that is a wrong mind, a mistaken mind, a non-mistaken mind. We distinguish between sense awarenesses versus mental awarenesses or mental consciousnesses. Then you have conceptual and non-conceptual, so especially on a mental level, what does it mean to conceptually perceive something? What are the limitations of that mind? What are the advantages of that mind? How can we use that? Then you have valid versus non-valid. The differentiation between those two. Valid minds knowing their objects incontrovertibly, okay, really understanding. And I guess after all the discussions we had, we can come to the conclusion there's really not that much we really know, incontrovertibly enough. That most of our perceptions of reality are done by non-valid cognizers, which please don't be fooled by the word not valid, as if it wasn't valid at all. That's not even the Tibetan, that's not even the literal translation of the Tibetan word. The Tibetan word tsema, tse kind of means measurement. Ma is kind of like just another syllable that makes it a noun, like ba or bo or ma or mo. Yeah, so in that sense, I don't even know like the real etymology of the word. Is that which measures, possibly, right? That which measures, that knows. And semin is that which doesn't, so it doesn't know. And in English, somehow the term was created, valid versus non-valid cognizer. I don't always use the same term, but like the term that other people use, but if it's so widely known, I mean, there's certain terminology that the idea is not discussed a lot. Certain ideas in Buddhism, they're not discussed that much, so then it's okay to use a different word if I don't agree with the word. But the word valid cognizer, I mean, Sema is so important in Buddhism, Pramana in Sanskrit, Sema in Tibetan. So this word is so important. It comes up so many times that changing it now doesn't make sense. So even though I don't think of the word so much, like it's not in Tibetan. It's not valid cognizer versus non-valid cognizer. Okay. Anyway, but it still works. So valid, as in like realizing its object. Non-valid, not realizing its object. That's it. So non-valid cognizers, we've heard. There are quite a few of them. Can you give me an example of a non-valid cognizer?
Wrong consciousness.
A wrong consciousness, yes. Correctly assuming consciousness, yes. Pardon? A doubting consciousness, yes.
The mind to which the object appears but is not apprehended.
Yes, an awareness to which the object appears but is not ascertained, yes, very good. What else? Pardon?
4 of it.
Huh? Yes?
4 of it.
4 of it, yeah. Well, you can come up with more, but never mind. That's good, that's great. Okay, very good. Those were the ones, yeah, there were 4 only mentioned here. Wrong consciousness, was that mentioned in there?
Yeah.
Oh, it was, okay. So then, yeah. Pardon?
Inferential.
No, inferential cognizer knows its object. Oh, that knows its object.
And subsequent cognizer?
Pardon?
Subsequent cognizer?
Well, they don't... I shouldn't wash my hands. Subsequent cognizers. They don't talk about subsequent cognizers here because valid cognizers in this school are not prime cognizers. Right? So they don't have the need for talking about... Daisy is talking about the lower schools. When they use the word pramana, when they describe pramana, it does not refer to like distinguishing between a mind that is pramana and not pramana. In the lower schools, you don't distinguish between realizing its object and not realizing its object. They say pramana is like a prime cognizer, a mind that newly realizes its object. And then, of course, you need to talk about a mind that doesn't newly realize its object, that subsequently realizes its object. You know, the first moment you realize something, and then the subsequent moments, they also realize their objects. You need to have a few moments for something to sink in. But in the Prasangika school, they don't mention that. So, I don't really know why in the lower schools. Well, it kind of makes sense why they talk about it, but in the end, it's not accepted.
Prasangika doesn't believe in the new incontrovertible. They say it's incontrovertible, but
no, they say newly incontrovertible. They believe in that, but they don't distinguish. They do say, I mean, you newly realize it, but they don't see it as important enough to apply a term, like to use the word tsema to only refer to that first moment. So that's the difference.
So it refers to all moments.
All the moments, every moment.
Tsema.
Every moment are tsema, that is pramana or valid cognition. Yeah. Okay.
Does the term also use inattentive attention for the object appearing but not ascertained? Is it only your schools use inattentive attention?
Oh, there's a translation of like an inattentive mind. No, the higher schools could call it an inattentive mind. I mean, it works the same way. It's just a different vocabulary, a different word. I use that word, nangla mange. Nangla means appear. La kind of means, in this case, but. And mange means not ascertained. So appearing but not ascertaining. Or not appearing but not ascertained. So in that sense, you have that long word. Unattentive would be not a non-literal translation. Okay. Anyway, having said all this, then we went through, therefore, these different types of awareness, and now we're no longer distinguishing between the different minds, categorizing them, but rather we're looking at one mind, and distinguishing between the different functions one single mind performs. And usually that is explained at the end. But not every text on the mind waits until it, some text actually it's explained at the beginning. But traditionally it comes towards the end. So, what did we say about yesterday? So you have those two categories, main minds and mental factors. Main, the word main can be a little misleading. It seems to suggest that to apprehend its object is kind of like primary to the mind, while the other functions are secondary, using the word primary or main. Sometimes people suggest kind of say basic, but basic sometimes has a negative connotation, as in like, just basic, not very sophisticated. But it's kind of like the basic in the sense of forming the basic perception of, or basic activity of every mind. The thing that every mind does, basically. It's like the main in the sense like, that's what makes the mind. It experiences its object. But then, of course, like a person, we took Alex as an example. So, saying that Alex, just as a person, his main function is to be a person. Sounds a bit bizarre. We don't talk like that usually, but it makes sense, doesn't it? And then, when that's all, we all have that function in common, to be a person. We can also say we all have in common that we want to be happy and we don't want to suffer. That's kind of like a basic function that we all perform. Wishing to be happy, not to suffer. Okay? And then there are these details. Then there are other functions, of course, that we all share. And then, from person to person, of course, we differ in terms of what we're good at, what we're not so good at, what we're well-versed in, like what we know about, what we don't know about, etc. Okay. So similarly here with the mind, sometimes the vocabulary is a little odd, and the examples, the analogies we use are also a little odd, because they seem to suggest mind and mental factors are totally separate. Actually, they are part and parcel. They're like you have one mind that has all these different functions, and you cannot separate those functions from the mind. In the same way as you cannot separate Alex the person versus Alex the cook. You really can't do that. We can only think about it separately for the sake of understanding. And here, because these mental functions are quite complicated and not right away understood, it takes a little bit of reflection. That's why we explain them separately. And like the way when I learned about this, I was first under the impression they're kind of separate, because we always explained separately until I understood, until it was made clear they are of one nature. They're not separate, they are of one nature. Like a body and its parts are of one nature. So it's really part and parcel. Alright, so these examples, these analogies can only go that far. Minister, kind of passive prime minister, and all the cabinet ministers, right? And then what else? The examples are the sun and the rays of the sun. Yeah, the five. Yeah, the hand, the palm of the hand and the 5 fingers. Okay, I've heard like soup and its ingredients, and right? Lots of different ideas or different analogies that may help. Yeah. All right. So having used those analogies, hopefully it's really clear what we mean. And so we got to page 41. Therefore, despite their different functions, a main mind cannot function without mental factors, and mental factors cannot function without a main mind. So if you replace function, factor with function, I think it works well. So there's this basic function, main function, versus the kind of more specific functions. And all of those need to be present for a mind to be active. Furthermore, a main mind and its mental factor are of one nature. Oh, here it is. Since the mental factors are a part of the main mind. The Buddhist scriptures describe the main mind as being concomitant. I kind of like that word because it doesn't mean that much to me. I catch myself sometimes using words, if I say associated, I associated with something that has nothing to do with mind and mental factors. So I can't really use it. Concomitant, I never used that word. So it's like, okay, I use that for the Tibetan word tsumba, which kind of means that they're but they keep changing. So I was in the concomitant mood. I also sometimes use associated. So they're associated. They're connected. They're concomitant. Such a word. I have to really watch out, like trying to translate and not really knowing what it means and kind of going, oh, never mind, I use that word. But then, of course, it has a totally different meaning and it becomes difficult. Okay. So, anyway, so concomitant or associated with this mental factor due to 5 similarities that they share. So, a main mind and its mental function, they're all the same in that there's a similarity of basis. Here you have the basis again. Another reason for why previously you couldn't call the main mind the basic mind, because the word basis was already, and it'll be explained. So, similarity of basis, similarity of observed object, object of engagement, similarity of time, and substantial entity. Trust me, in Tibetan it doesn't mean anything to you, in the same way as it doesn't mean anything to you when you just read through it. Ben, mikba, namba, and so forth. Okay. I'm not even sure that's correct here, but anyway, the similarity of basis. The similarity of basis refers to the main mind and its concomitant mental factors. So you use the word, if you don't just say main mind and mental factors, because you could have the main mind of this mind and the mental factors of another mind. So to indicate, here we're talking about one mind of the functions that are concomitant with that main mind. So that's a way of expressing it in Tibetan. In Tibetan, you would cite the main mind and then say all the mental factors that are associated with it, that are concomitant with that. So then there's no confusion. You're talking about one particular awareness. And that awareness that comes along with the main function and comes along with other functions, so those come from the same empowering condition. Now, if you have an I consciousness, what is the empowering condition that gives rise to an I consciousness? Pardon? What is the I sense power? Very good. Great. Oh yeah, good. You all kind of remember. I think so. What is the empowering condition of the ear consciousness? Ear sense power. Okay. All right. So same thing. So they arise from the same cause, basically, from the same course empowering condition. What is the empowering condition of a mental consciousness? It has one, but it's just the previous moment of consciousness, right? So it doesn't have a physical basis, but it has a previous moment that gives rise to it. Okay. Therefore, both a main mind that is an I consciousness and its mental factor that are also I consciousnesses. They're just, when you say functions, they really mean you see, when I say Alex, I can say Alex, the person, and I can say Alex's ability to cook. When I say Alex's ability to cook, I'm talking literally about his function. But when I say Alex the cook, I'm pointing out a function that is actually I'm pointing out a function that a particular person possesses. Right? So it's the same thing here. Any of these mental factors, we're basically saying that consciousness which we're mentioning here with regard to this particular function. Right? So to give you an example, there's one mental factor that's called discernment or discrimination. It's that ability of the mind to discern. So when we say discernment, we're talking about a particular, so let's say we take an I consciousness. So you have I consciousness that perceives its object. You have I consciousness that discerns. They're not contradictory, right? We have Alex the person, we have Alex the cook. Are we talking about two different people? No. We're talking about the same person, but we're stressing certain abilities, right? Certain functions. Alex the person is just the main person. Then Alex the cook. So likewise, I consciousness, that is discernment. I consciousness, that is, okay. And Alex the person can cook, and Alex the cook studies. So they do all these different things, but I'm just kind of emphasizing a particular quality or a particular ability. That's what we're doing here too. And it takes a while to understand that. It's so weird, the vocabulary. But how else are you going to say it? Right? There's a Tibetan way of saying it. Discernment is the awareness from the perspective of the mind's ability that discerns. Right? Alex the cook is Alex from the perspective of Alex's special ability to be able to cook. Wow, that's a mouthful, right? So therefore we will just keep it simple and just say Alex the cook. So same here. I consciousness, that is discernment. I consciousness, that is the main mind. I consciousness, that is feeling, etc. Okay. Anyway, so all of those are in this case I consciousnesses. In fact, they're synonymous. I mean, well, they don't really say synonymous. They don't say synonymous in the same sense. It refers to the same mind, but they still distinguish that Alex, from the point of view of being a cook, is not Alex from the point of view of being a student. Okay? It refers to the same person, but you wouldn't say they're synonymous. All right. Therefore, both the main mind, that is an I consciousness, and its mental factors, that are also I consciousnesses, have arisen in dependence on the same I sense power. Both the main mind, that is an ear consciousness, and its mental factors, that are also ear consciousnesses, have arisen in dependence on the same ear sense power, and so forth, because they refer to the same mind. In the case of the mental consciousness, both the main mind, that is a mental factor, and its mental factors, that are also mental consciousnesses, have arisen from the same preceding mental consciousness. Okay. All right, so that is in terms of having the same base, arising from that same cause. The similarity of the observed object. The similarity of the observed object refers to the main mind, its mental factor, having the same observed object. I don't think that's right. Then number. I don't know, I have to look it up. I don't think I used the right word here. Anyway. Both focus on the same self. Okay, alright. So maybe actually correct. So the main mind and its mental factor having the same observed object. That's this is a bit of a difficulty that we haven't mentioned yet. And so sometimes, so far we've only mentioned appearing object and object of engagement. Of course, if there are more objects, sometimes, the way these texts are structured are that you bombard the student with all the different kinds of objects right from the beginning. But that can make it a little difficult, because then you need to differentiate and right away memorize. Sometimes what's easier is to only explain them two types of objects until they become familiar. And then in the context of explaining another idea altogether, you also introduce another way in which you can look at objects. So then you are used to the first way. The first way, you've already grown familiar with it. You've got some stability in terms of your understanding. If you now introduce it slightly differently, you're not overwhelmed. It's like how you study math. You start with maybe addition and then subtraction. You don't bombard the students right away. Once you're kind of solid in one, you move on to the next. So here in this context, suddenly observed objects are mentioned. But it's not hard to understand. This usually refers to the fact that, for instance, not with every mind, but a mind can, for instance, know that, let's say a conceptual mind, that this object, that this table is blue. This table is blue. So you have a table and you have blue. Okay? So now, appearing object versus object of engagement, possibly both appear, and you know both. Okay? You know table, the table appears, blue appears, the table being blue appears to the mind, plus you know that table is blue. So the appearing object and the object of engagement do not help you to distinguish between table versus blue. Right? Table being blue. So here in Buddhism you have these distinctions between a characteristic and the basis for the characteristic. Okay? The table is the basis. In this case, of course, a blue table, it has the characteristic of being blue. So the table is what you focus on, and based on that, now you recognize that that table is blue. So it's an object, it's an observed object. They use that word observed object. The same word they said when they said observed object condition. But here it kind of means something a little bit different. It means that which the mind focuses on. Focuses on the table and then knows certain things about them, certain characteristics. So when we want to get to know an object, we take that object as our focal object, as that which is observed, the focal object, and then understand it by focusing on all the details, right? It's not that hard, is it? We all do it all the time. It's not difficult to understand, except we don't give it words such as, this is the focal object, and this is the aspect of the object. Okay? Or here in this case, the object of engagement. Okay? Although both objects are engaged. So this is where it gets really complicated. It is sometimes made complicated purposely, because otherwise you have nothing to debate. Right? Yes. Some of those texts, like, I put it together like from texts that are really complicated. Like the way they're written is like, it doesn't tell you A is B. No, it'd be most straightforward. It tells you A is E, whatever is E must be F, but whatever is F is also necessarily D. Therefore, A is D. Right? It's not straightforward. So you need to read it a few times. You can't just lay back and just be totally relaxed and inattentive. No, it's not like reading a story. Could be written like a story, but it's not written like a story. Because it needs you to see. So in that way you see the connections between other things and you pay better attention. You see, all the study in Buddhism is meant to increase your, I don't know which word to use, intelligence or wisdom, because in Tibetan they don't have the same distinction between intelligence and wisdom. It's basically, we distinguish between a kind of coarser type of wisdom, a discerning kind of wisdom, and a more intuitive wisdom, a primordial, pristine wisdom. They're different words, Sherab and Yeshe. So, with regard to those two, Sherab is more the one that you use right now to develop, etc. And then at some point it becomes Yeshe, that more intuitive wisdom. So it's a degree of having a coarse kind of understanding, a more rational kind of understanding, and then taking it just to a deeper level. So different words are used. And in terms of training your mind, I mean, a lot of the types of wisdom that, or intelligence, if you like, that Buddhists talk about, Westerners wouldn't talk about. Like, for instance, they say a person has a certain, like Rigpa, they also use the word Rigpa as in like Rigpa Yavudu. I have good intelligence, for instance, as an example. So that kind of means more if you're in school and you're doing good at certain topics. So it doesn't refer to any spiritual kind of wisdom or spiritual understanding, but it's seen as a basis for spiritual understanding. So if you have a certain degree of understanding, then that helps you when you start your Buddhist understanding. And they don't talk about, they say inborn, yes, they do accept that children are born with it, but there's no sense that you cannot change it. You can be born with no intelligence and you can totally develop that, okay, as a human being. We all have that potential. So in the West, sometimes we may have a sense, especially in the past, that children are stuck with a certain intelligence. Also, if they're good at math, they're intelligent. If they're good at something else, they're not necessarily intelligent. In Buddhism, there's a vast variety of different intelligence, right? They're good at making pupa. That's also a type of intelligence. It's a kind of rigpa, right? Not seen as the most important one, but, you know, the person can cook. That's a type of, it comes from the mind. You can put ingredients together in a way in which you know they fit together. That's a type of intelligence, okay? It can be learned. Some people are more talented when it comes to that and others are less. Okay. Memorizing is a type of intelligence. Being able to memorize. It's seen as a type of intelligence. So there are those who are good at debate and not that good at memorizing. There are those that are good at memorizing, not that good at debating. There are those that are both and neither. So they're all seen as different kind of rigpa. Because of course memorizing is not that easy. You need to have concentration, a certain degree of concentration, a certain degree of mindfulness. And if you're lacking those, it's harder. So those are all part of what's called intelligence, what's described as part of one's intelligence. Does that make sense? Okay. So, therefore, there's this wide spectrum of different types of intelligence. Okay, having said so, now, knowing something, you can just know the thing itself, have like a coarse knowledge of just vas, versus knowing things about it. So the more thorough, of course, you are with its analysis, the more you get to know about the object. For instance, to give you another example, taking the self and its lack of inherent existence. Its focal object is the self. And then you understand one of its qualities, lack of inherent existence, the fact that it doesn't exist inherently. It's a characteristic of the mind. It's a characteristic. It changes moment by moment. Even the fact that I am not desi, it's one of my characteristics, right? It's one of my attributes. The attribute that I am myself, but I'm not desi. That's an attribute. I am not a table. I'm not a this. I'm not a that. Right? Usually just knowing, just in general knowing me, having one sense, I know that I'm not a table. Okay? Or other people would know that. So that's not impressive in any way that someone knows that. But then there are other things that I'm changing moment by moment. That's a characteristic that is not as obvious to us. That I don't exist inherently. Again, that's a characteristic we really need to give it some thought. So therefore it's helpful to think of phenomena they can be characteristics and they can be bases. Okay? So the self can be also a characteristic, right? Myself, I have a self. In that sense, I have a self. So the self in that case becomes a characteristic. Or I, yesterday, is also I. Okay? I yesterday, I tomorrow. I at a certain point in time is my I. Right? My conventional I. So that becomes a characteristic in that moment. See what I'm saying? Like a yellow car being a car. That's a car. So it's a characteristic being a car. So anything can be a basis, if that's your focal object, if you try to understand it. But it can also serve as a characteristic of something else. Does that make sense? Okay. So in that sense, that's very much a way in which we look at phenomena. If I analyze it, is it my basis for analysis? Is it that which I focus on and I try to understand something about? Or do I use something else as the basis, and that thing, may it be a car or whatever, I use that as a characteristic to understand this other object. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that kind of make sense? No? No? Okay.
Yes, but and both are observed.
No. I'm not talking about observed. I'm just explaining this. So, therefore, anything I can take as my base, I can take as a focal object, that's what I like to understand. And then take characteristics that help me in my effort to understand it. That's it. But I can focus on something else, and my previous focal object can become a characteristic. Right? For instance, I say table. What are the characteristics of a table? Once I understand that, then I take a specific table, a wooden table, and understand that is also a table. So whereas previously table was the basis, based on which I understood it must have a surface, it must have something that holds it erect, blah, 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 whatever is the definition of a table. Now I take a specific table and understand that's my focal object, and understand that is also a table. The characteristic that I've previously understood. That's how we gain knowledge. Understanding things one after the other, and understanding one is a characteristic, one is this, etc. All right. But we just don't use those words. Basis of characteristic, kishi, kechu. Kishi, kechu, right? Ke as in like kebudu. Ke kind of can also means difference. So difference, ke as in like difference. So like a different phenomenon. It's like a different characteristics basically. Kechu. And keshi is again ke as in like something different, and the basis for that. The basis for that difference. What makes the difference? It is the different characteristics that differentiate one thing from another. Okay? And this is where the word comes from.
Blue table, can blue be the main object and table be the characteristic?
Blue, no, that's difficult. Having blue as the basis and table being the characteristic, it doesn't always work. Because blue is not a table. I can say a table is blue. Alright?
But that's in English. In other languages you can use both.
Can you say...
Adjective can be before or later of the subject.
But that doesn't mean that if you use it the other way around, but okay, if you mean like...
If we talk about colors...
No, but if it's the other way around, then you would also have the characteristic come first. And in his case, he was asking about the basis and then characteristic, right?
Here's the point. If you're looking for, supposing the purpose is look for whatever is blue. Then blue becomes your object.
Becomes the new object.
That's true, but that's not. The table is not the characteristic of blue. It's just an example of something that is blue.
Okay.
Right? A particularity. It's just a particularity of it. Like usually, characteristic means I lacks inherent existence. I is impermanent. The table is blue. Anyway, we don't need to discuss this. Look, that's not really important here.
The other way around doesn't help.
Maybe you want to think that way. Never mind. If it helps you... Sorry. Maybe it's not that important, right? If you feel you want to switch it around, you can also do that. The point is basically we understand that we can focus on one aspect and then understand something about it by looking at its characteristics. If it works for you the other way around, I don't think there's a problem. Maybe in some languages. In Tibetan, it doesn't work that way. So usually you talk about something being a basis that is something or has something. I have, for instance, legs and arms, etc. So that's also a characteristic. My parts and the qualities which I am, right? I am a person. I am impermanent, etc. Okay? So these two characteristics between phenomena, being something and having something. That's usually what describes things. Does that make sense? Being something and having something. And then whichever way you'd like to turn it. So, but that's not why I'm talking about this. The main reason I'm talking about this is because I want to differentiate between a focal object and then the object of engagement. Or sometimes it's also described as the aspect. Which is why I'm not sure. Somehow in my mind I'm thinking this is wrong. But I don't want to go now to the iPad and just look up the word.
I have it written down from both Vasubandhus and Asanga's Abhidharmas.
I don't want Vasubandhus, I want Asanga. Vasubandhu is not the source.
Yeah, it's the second one, similar object of observation and subjective aspect.
That's the aspect. Okay, so subjective. I'm not sure subjective is a good term here because I don't know, but it would be number. It would just be number. So I don't know where the object of engagement comes in, but I have the sense it's more number, as in like an aspect of it. So the focal object, the thing itself, and an aspect of it.
You mean observed object is the focal object?
Yeah, the observed object is that focal object. In Tibetan, mikpa means to observe. Mik. Or mikpa as like being like observing. Mik means to observe, or mikpa if you take the whole verb. And the verb can also be used as a noun, then it's that which is observed. Alright? So just not to be too technical, but you have like a focal object and then you have its aspects. And those aspects can be characteristics in the sense, well, characteristic as in like the focal object is those things, or it can be parts of it, aspects of it, or parts of it, which the thing has, right? I'm just so used to it. This is my whole training to think about objects. If you take yourself, what makes you as a person? You have parts. I'm tempted to use the word aspects, but I don't want to use it because otherwise it gets confusing. I have parts and I have attributes. What else? How else would you do? So anything you say about me concerns any of those two. If you want to describe me, you say, she has a mind. That is a part of me. She is a woman. That is a characteristic. So if you try to describe me, if I existed inherently, you didn't have to use anything other than a part or a characteristic. You could actually describe me by just using my name. But we can't do that. Because I don't exist inherently, you always have to use something other than me to describe me. Right? Because I don't exist inherently, so you have to always use something else. In fact, when you see me, you always see something other than me. You never see me. Me as in like what we would say, me is the complete thing, but you never see that. You never see the complete person Kasamomo, whatever, right? So you never see that. You only see an aspect of that. That's why it's so important to understand that. It's part of understanding emptiness to a certain degree. Understand what things are made of to see there's nothing. If you want to just describe that person, you always end up using one of those parts or attributes to describe the person. When you see me, when you perceive me, you perceive a part or an attribute. Right? Usually a part. Okay? Part. Like my face or my body. That's all you can see. So it's always something you cannot. The table, it's the same for the table. You never see the whole table. And still you say, I see the table. If you put something on the table, you don't put something on the entire table. On a part of it. If the table breaks, it's usually a part of it breaks. Not everything, not every atom breaks. You see? So that's why the table doesn't exist inherently, because if it did, if there was an inherent table, then its parts breaking had nothing to do with the table. Or if the table broke, all its parts would have to break. So I'm taking it a little bit to emptiness, although here we talk mainly on the mind, but of course it's the main topic. We have this mind to understand that. And we use this idea, of course, of objects, what they're composed of, understanding them, then helps us to take them apart and realize there's no essence, there's no inherent this, that, and the other. Does that help a little bit? So, now when the mind focuses on an object, because how can we understand an object? We can only understand an object through the mind. Okay? So, before we can understand the object, we understand the mind and understand how it perceives its object. Right? So, one way is it has a focal object and an aspect. Okay? So, that's what the mind does. So not only does it perceive table, etc., what else it can do, even the sense consciousness, can know this is a table. This is the focal object, is a table. Okay? We had that discussion before. Does an eye consciousness only know table? Or can it know this is, does the eye consciousness only know person, or does it know this person is my father? And there's a lot of assertion, a lot of people say yes, it can. There's a little bit of disagreement on that. To us, it seems no. To us, oftentimes it seems no. The sense consciousness is only a passive perceiver, and then knowing it is this, that, and the other doesn't happen on the level of an eye consciousness. I'm more inclined to think we do. No, please. No, not now. This discussion we will never come an end to while we're here, because we discuss this all the time, like over years and years, right? Like knowing this, knowing that. So maybe just for the time being in the discussion group, of course it can be addressed, but we'll never come to, because there's disagreement on that.
But it's not. Some things are just not clear. You're talking about parts, attributes, intelligences, characteristics, functions, and factors. It's not got a common language. It seems like it's jumping about here. A lot of what you're saying, certainly for me, is not landing. So
okay.
Sorry.
No. That's fine. If it was just a disagreement, as I thought that was in your case, that's different.
For me,
but just not understanding, that's a different matter. Okay. Then I need to address that, definitely. So does anyone else feel that way? Parts, attributes, characteristics, functions, it's difficult?
It does need clarified.
It needs clarified. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. This is the other questions that I want to take, if it's like discussions as in like disagreeing, that's different. But if there's no understanding, I try to address them.
It's understandable, it's just like it could be better.
It could be better. Okay. I try to make an improvement. Pardon? Okay, so there's the difficulty in understanding in general, and there's the difficulty in seeing who cares. In what form. Okay. All right. Well, if you understand that from Buddha's point of view, here, of course, the mind has objects, and we'll move away from the mind here a little bit in terms of understanding the objects, in the sense that how do phenomena exist? That is a huge question in Buddhism. It's not about do phenomena exist? Yes, of course they do. But it's how do they exist? Right? What makes a table a table? What makes a table, for instance? Okay? Now this goes to the most difficult aspect in Buddhism. What makes a table a table? How can I say I see a table? How can I say I know a table? Right? So we talk about parts of the table. Tim, does that make sense? Parts of the table. So the surface, the legs, etc. Then we talk about attributes or characteristics of the table. Size, color. They're also part of it, but we can more specifically use words such as it is big, it is blue, it is, right? In that sense, characteristics as in like this object being those things. Okay? Having parts, this table has a surface, but it's not a surface. It has a color, and it is blue. Does that make sense? That distinction. So over the years of study, we distinguish between parts that the object has, but if it has them, it is not those parts. But then we talk about things that make up the table, that are part of the table, if you like, that the table is. They are described as attributes. So it is tall, it is big, it is small, etc. Okay, as part of that. And then due to those parts, those attributes, then we can say it performs a function. Alright? So anything you say about table, in the end, concerns one of those. When I say describe the table, to one degree or another, you're going to talk about the parts, you're going to talk about the attributes, and about the function. Tim, so far clear?
Fine, yeah.
So where is there still the difficulty?
Sorry, please, go on.
Okay. So, no, I just want to make sure I'm not talking about something that you already understood, but I neglect what is still confusing. That's why I keep checking.
So characteristic and attribute are a synonym.
Yes, characteristic. Character. I'm using it as an...
Use both of them.
Yes, characteristic, attribute, aspect. Well, aspect in Tibetan is a word. It's a little bit difficult to use it. It's sometimes used interchangeably, but not always. So the Buddhist language is like attribute, characteristic, sometimes feature are used interchangeably, as in like the English words feature, characteristic, attribute.
And focal and observed as well.
Pardon?
What is the difference between aspect and attribute?
Well, aspect is a difficult word, as in like it can include also a part. So a function is an aspect, a part is an aspect, an attribute is an aspect. It's right? So even in the Tibetan language, I'm literally translating the Tibetan language here, because the ideas are set forth in that language, just using equivalent words in English. So, and they're not that consistent. Of course, there's also disagreements sometimes. People use words slightly differently, but you have definitely attributes, characteristics, features. Those words are oftentimes used interchangeably. Then you have just parts, as in like spatial parts, as an example, and you have functions. Does that make sense? Still makes sense, right? So a person has parts such as mind and body. Is not a mind, is not a body. A person is not his mind or her mind, and is not his or her body. Then a person has characteristics: kind, helpful, impermanent, tall. All these things, they are... When I say something about a person, I talk about mental characteristics and physical characteristics. Tall, what have you, thin, etc. All those. And then performs functions. A lot of functions. Can walk, can talk, can bring happiness to people, can bring suffering to people. Those are all functions. So if you say anything about any phenomenon, every phenomenon has those three in common. It has parts. It is made of things that are other than itself. It has characteristics, which it is. It is this, that, and the other. And due to all those, it engages in actions, it performs functions. So I said before, like sometimes performing this function seems to suggest an agency that is to us a little strange. To say a table performs the function of holding things, as if it's kind of like having the intention to hold something. But that's just a matter of talking. Okay? So holding a table, holding something, it does of course not mean it has a mind and an attention to do so, but it still performs that function. Tima, just check with you now. Does that clear some of the confusion, or is there still confusion left?
It's helping.
It's helping. Good. Does anyone else feel? Yes.
I'm just trying to relate it in the context of observed object. Just make sure.
I'm not yet getting there.
Okay.
Allow me to just complete that basis, and then we go back to the observed object. So I've consciously also therefore ignored what you said before, because I don't want to go back to that yet. I just want to make sure this part is understood, and then I continue with the text.
But is it synonymous observed and focal? When we are
we'll come to this. Let me just the basis, and then I'll explain that, right? Not to confuse people. Yes?
Just about what you were saying right now, for parts we have another definition.
For parts
we have attributes, features, characteristics, which are all the same.
Yeah.
And then parts, you have another word for that?
Oh, I used, for instance, spatial parts, but not everything has spatial parts. Parts, like a part, I use the word part. I mean, actually, I would say the impermanence is also a part of me, like in a wider sense. But to distinguish between a part, like let's say A is the basis. A is the basis. So if I say, take for instance B. If A is B, then you wouldn't describe it as a part. We're talking, in the sense here, like a part which is possessed by A, but A is not that. For instance, my leg. My leg, I'm A, right? And I have a leg, that's B. But I'm not my leg. So in that sense, a part that I only possess, but that I am not. That's a difference, right? So I have a mind, but I'm not my mind. I have impermanence, and I am impermanent. Do you see? I have a color, I have a color, it's weird, like a table you would rather say. Like a table has a color, it has the color blue, and it is blue. So in that sense, a part here, I try to use a word here to distinguish between a part which that thing has but is not. You see, there's a distinction. Okay? So I can say, I have a mind, but I'm not my mind. Okay? But I am angry because I have anger. Does that make sense? I am angry. So being angry is a characteristic of myself. Being that's a characteristic.
The word she used was feature.
Pardon?
Feature or aspect.
No, feature is for...
No, feature is attribute.
Well, I don't know. I'm just using... You see? In Tibetan, you don't have these three words, but they've started using them in English as attribute, characteristic. Maybe even leave out feature if that's too confusing. You see, the thing is, the words are now confusing, the ideas are not. The ideas are not that difficult. We're getting confused now with the terminology. But if you just understand that each object possesses certain things, and some of those things, it is them, and some of those things, it just has. Right? Okay, that's it. That's how far we go. Right? And to find words for those, I'm trying to find words for those, but why am I using attribute and characteristic? Why am I confusing you? Because you may come across a text where they use those two words. So then it's not like, oh my God, because Mama talked about one thing, this is talk about something different. No, they're just using, right? So this is Buddhist language that has become more common. Okay? Does that make sense? A little bit. Like this kind of you have just certain things that are part of you in that sense. Some of those parts you are, some of those parts you're not. And some describe your function. Okay? All right. That helps us to understand how things exist. Sorry, I didn't want to.
Also, negation of stuff could be part of...
Even a negation.
Yeah.
I am... What's your name again? Aina. I'm not Aina. Me not being Aina is a characteristic of me. That's my characteristic. It's part of who I am. I'm not Aina. I'm not a table. I'm not this. I'm not that. Who cares? But it's still true. Why am I emphasizing not? Because I'm not inherently existent. That's a characteristic. So here I have a million negation of something, and not negating it is the cause for all my trouble. If you really believe that, you get a sense why we talk about negatives. Buddhism is really into negatives. Right? Some people believe you cannot even know negatives. That's a misperception. You can know negatives. I can know I'm not Aina. Aina?
T at the end, Ainat.
A-not. I'm not A-not. I can know I'm not A-not. Right? I can know I am not inherently existent. I'm not permanent. I need to know that. Okay. So, going back to now. So sorry, what I do as part of this course, and this is really not strictly part of Lorig, bring emptiness in. I think emptiness is so important. It's so fascinating, and it's so not impossible for us to understand. And to understand that understanding of the mind also goes back to understanding that, may open some doors, although it confuses us for now. Okay, now going back to this here. Having understood this way of how phenomena exist, a focal object, now we can talk about a mind has a focal object, and then it knows a focal object or an observed object. So this word, it's mikba. In Tibetan, the word mikba is used, right? Some people use a focal object, which is more of it's not a literal translation, it's more of a translation of the meaning of the word. So the focal object. Okay, mikba. So it's that basis. It's that basis. And then you have the aspect. So the similarity of the object of engagement, I don't know how I got there from object of engagement. That seems wrong, and I still think, because it says aspect in other texts. I want to see the Tibetan word, because just the English translation doesn't help. But I'll go back and I look at my Tibetan text, then I go back to my room. But anyway, so the similarity of the aspect. So the aspect means, here in this context, when you mention both focal object and aspect, that if the focal object is the vas, then the aspect is function, part, or attribute. Does that make sense? Okay. So any mind, if it's a main mind, it takes to mind that focal object, it focuses on that focal object, and the mental factor does too. It's the same focal object. And then with regard to all the attributes that you may consider in that moment, then also that's true for main mind and mental factors. Now what I just explained is not important for understanding main mind and mental factors, but it comes here as in like the 5 similarities from the point of view of these 5. There's no difference between mind and mental factors. So why are they associated? How can we say they're closely connected? Well, basically they're closely connected because they arise from the same cause. If one is the focal object of the main mind, if something is like the table is the focal object of the main mind, is the focal object of the mental factors. They don't have different objects, in other words. And if that main mind takes as its focal object the table, then the mental factors take the table as the main object, right? And if then that main mind perceives the table as blue, that is the aspect, then the mental factors do too, right? And so both appear. The table and blue appear. So object of appearance and so forth, to distinguish between those two is not helpful because they're both the appearing object. So something is both are the appearing object, both are the object of engagement, but you distinguish between that which you focus on and that which is the attribute or part of it that you try to understand. Okay? Because the mind doesn't just know vas. It can know vas is big, small, etc. In fact, to understand something, we turn it into a focal object and understand what its function is, what its attribute is, and what its parts are. What are the parts that it possesses? Peter, does that make sense? You look like a question mark on your face. Okay, great. That's just misperception. Tim, does that make sense? Yes? What's your name? Sam. Sam, does that make sense? And you think it's a little clearer? What's your name?
I was just commenting on the language bit.
No, that's fine. But is it a little bit clearer with the language now? What's your name? William. So, okay. No, just to check with those who ain't that, is it a little bit... Yeah. Okay, it's good. I'm glad you expressed that, and it needed to be explained. And it's not, like I said, part of Lorig, but if you want to pursue this further, I think it's very important, right? Is it still? Still?
I have a question. Like just a clarification of the two words.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say mikba, would be the focal object
mm-hmm.
and the aspect, it contains the both?
No.
Okay, so when we say mikba, is focal object as well as observed object. Those two, focal and observed object,
it's just a different translation.
Okay, different translation meaning the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And mikba is the observed object, which, for example, is the vase.
So
an aspect is, for example, the attribute of the base.
Yes, exactly.
So we can.
Sorry, let me just interrupt you. This is what's so complicated in Buddhism. For instance, like I said before, sometimes you use the word cause. You use the word seed and imprint. Remember I talked about seed and imprint yesterday. A seed is an imprint is a seed. Okay. But when you use them separately, when you use them as a pair, seed, imprint, then the seed is not the imprint is not a seed. There are a lot of examples like that. A lot of examples in Buddhism where, for instance, cause and condition are said to be equivalent. Cause and condition. So, a cause of a sprout is its main cause, which is the seed. Right? That seed is also a condition. And then water and fertilizer, they are causes and they are conditions. But if you put them next to each other, the seed and the fertilizer, the seed becomes the cause as in like the main cause that transforms into the sprout, and the fertilizer and the warmth and the water, they are just the cooperative condition. So here you call one the cause and one the condition, although they're both conditions and they're both causes. So you have this very often, like with seed imprint, as just explained. Here, actually, if I just take to mind the vase, it's a focal object, it's the aspect. It is an aspect, it is a focal, it's both. But when I distinguish between focal object and if I bring both together, by implication, I'm having both here. Then, by implication, focal object and aspect, if I bring them here, I'm saying, there are two. What are those two? Let's take the table, that's the focal object, the aspect is any kind of part of that. Does that make sense? Yes. Right? So you learn this. You just say focal object, anything can be a focal object. But you bring those two together, you know right away, there are two things here, and now you distinguish. Seed and imprint, same thing. If I just say, an imprint is a seed is an imprint, but now I mention the seed of anger and the imprint of anger. Why would, if they mean the same thing, why would I mention them separately? By implication, I know, here I must have something, one is a seed and not an imprint, and one is an imprint that is not a seed. So in that combination of the two of them, they take on a different meaning. Cause and condition the same. The cause of a sprout and the condition of a sprout. You go, if they're the same, I didn't mention them. One refers to the cause, they transformed, the seed that became the sprout, and the other one are just the cooperative conditions. So you're so trained in that. It's helpful. It is very helpful to understand that cause and condition, as an example, they share a lot of attributes. They're very similar, but there's still a difference when it comes down to it. That's what we learn through this. We don't have that in the English language, but it's part of the study. If you already know, for instance, object and object possessor. Have you ever heard that word? Object and object possessor. Object is fine. What is an object possessor? A mind. A mind is, in Tibetan you say yul is object, yu jen. Jen just means to have. The haver. I can't say that in English. The haver of the... So you say possessor, which sounds bizarre, but you have no other word. So jen just means to possess. So yul, yujin. Right? Yul, yujin. Yu, gen. Yu, gen. Sabun, pakja. So you always bring these pairs together. Okay? Mikban number. So yul, yujin. Yul means object. Yujin is that which does something with the object. Okay? For instance, consciousness. Consciousness possesses an object because it perceives an object. Sound is an object possessor. Sound as in like expressive sound. The word vas expresses vas. So it's an object possessor. A person is an object possessor. Because as a person, since I have a mind, so those are the three object possessors. A person, an expressive sound, that is a word that expresses something, and a mind. Those are all object possessors. Okay? This is basic Buddhist philosophy. You learn that in the first year. first year when you really start at the bottom. Here we're doing a course that is one of the introductory courses, but there's another one before that, which is too abstract. Unless you debate it, it'll be hard. But some of these aspects, I introduce them to you. Some aspects you don't need. So, an object and something that does something with the object. An object possessor. Does that make sense? Actually, any object possessor is also an object. Any object possessor is an object. But when you describe those two together, you don't talk about it that way. You talk about a mind or a word that expresses something or a person as only that having an object and the object. Again, one of those pairs. One of those pairs. So those are the ones I can think of right now. Okay? And it's confusing now. I know it's confusing. But there are just a few basic ideas. When you get those, right, seed, imprint, and what I just described, it's not that difficult. And trust me, the second time you hear it, it becomes easy. All right. Now, going back to what I said here.
Take a break.
Take a break. Okay. I don't know if people will come back after that. All right, take a break for 15 minutes. You're welcome to come forward. So going back to just those similarities, okay, it was a little confusing, and I probably made it more confusing than it's supposed to be. What I'm trying to say is that there's another way in which you can distinguish between a mind focusing on something specific and then also on its characteristics, on its parts, etc. Only to stress that, okay? So if that's the case for a main mind, it's the case for the mental factors and vice versa. So of course you may not totally understand that yet. Of course, why would you? I mean, you haven't done this for years and years. And many of the questions may remain. But anyway, the main aspect to understand here is that to understand that relationship between main function and kind of not subsidiary, but like the other functions of the mind, to understand those, understand that they arise from the same cause, they have the same object, they arise at the same time. That's the next aspect, right? So, I haven't even read the other ones here yet, but the similarity of the observed object, if we go back to this, just to read them. And now instead of saying object of engagement, I use aspect. So don't be confused. I'll change this now, and you may want to cross it out, because object of engagement, I don't even know where I have that from. So the similarity of the observed object, or the focal object, another translation, refers to the main mind and its mental factor having the same observed object. Hence, the main mind and its mental factor focus on the same object. In the case of a main mind that apprehends that the self is impermanent, and its concomitant factors that also apprehend that the self is impermanent, they both focus on the same object, the self. Right? Similarly, in the case of a main mind that apprehends the vas, and its concomitant mental factors that also apprehends the vas, they both focus on the same object, the vas. Okay. Then the similarity of the aspect, not object of engagement. The similarity of the engagement refers to the aspect refers to the main mind and its mental factor having the same aspect, or same aspect. It's so difficult because in Tibetan the aspect of a mind is something again different. But again, the same object, which is the aspect. Object? Because never mind, forget what I said. This means that the main mind and its mental factor apprehend the same aspect. In the case of a main mind that apprehends that the self is impermanent and its concomitant mental factors that also apprehend that the self is impermanent, they both apprehend the same object of engagement, the self being impermanent. Okay? Now, if you don't have A is B, if your mind doesn't perceive that, then the focal object and the aspect are the same. Does that make sense? If you just perceive vas, if your eye consciousness perceives just vas, not vas big, vas small, whatever, just vas as the eye consciousness. When you just perceive an object without going any further, then the focal object and the aspect are the same. Is that confusing? No. Okay, good. So only in case you have the two separate, like if they're two separate. So you always mention them as the 5 similarities, but only if you have A is B. Your mind cannot do any further than either just perceiving A or perceiving something about A. A is this, that, and the other. That's how the mind basically works. And of course you can take then any characteristic, any part of the object, you can take to mind one after the other, of course. Does that make sense? And again, the focal object is so important because when we realize emptiness, the focal object is a particular thing. There is no emptiness that you can realize, like just emptiness. You cannot realize that. You cannot realize just emptiness. It doesn't exist, just emptiness. Because there must be something that is empty of inherent existence. Right? Inherent, like emptiness refers to the lack of inherent existence. But of something. That something doesn't exist inherently. Okay, so in the end, it's the same as numbers, really. I can think of 1, 2, 3, etc. separately, but they don't exist separately. There's 1 because there's something that is a single object. There's 2 because there's something that consists of 2. Right? So I can think of emptiness separately, but really it comes down to like referring to something specific. And I start off with like analyzing the table. How does the table exist? Can I find the table? And if I don't find something that is within these parts, if I don't find that, this unfindability, that's not finding the table is the lack of inherent existence. Because you're looking for something inherent. You're looking for something within the object. As in like, they sometimes say from the side of the object. Something objectively existent, inherently existent, independently existent. So you're actually looking for the same thing within this object. Because where do you look for the table? Not somewhere else. We all agree that the table, if it exists, it's only to be found here. Right? Among its parts. And then we look, where's that table? And with the self, it's even more. Like, I think I all the time. Where's the I? Where is that I? Is it... I only look for the I here. I don't look next to me. Okay? Where's the I? That's my focal object. And then I look. And I'm really looking for... I'm not looking for a conventional I. Okay? I'm not looking for a conventional I. The conventional I is that which is merely labeled. But that is not the one I'm attached to. That is not the one I'm obsessing about. That is not the one I'm worried about. If it's just labeled, what is there so to be worried about? It seems to be a single entity. It's not just the I that is labeled. I label I when my hand writes. I label on the basis of my arm. I label the I writes. When my feet walk, or my legs walk, I label I on those. So the basis of interpretation is always different. So it cannot be a single I in the sense of like always the same. Because the basis of interpretation changes depending on what this body and this mind does. But to me it seems there's just one single entity that's somehow separate from mind and body. Okay? And that's when I start looking for that, I'm no longer looking for a conventional I, I'm looking for an inherent I. Some intrinsic I. That's my focal object. And now anything I analyze, it becomes the aspect of that. But here I'm taking an aspect that is not, that I, which doesn't exist, an inherent I, that is, or no, actually an I in general, okay, an I in general, but now I take the aspect of inherent existence, which doesn't exist, but still, even the aspect doesn't exist, I can still analyze it. Okay? Inherent existence. Does it exist inherently? If it existed inherently, it would follow, it would be independent. It would be independent of mind. It would remain the same. It would be found. The more I looked for it, the clearer it would get. If it really existed somewhere in my mind and body, it would become clearer and clearer and clearer. But it doesn't. So in the end, as I go through this analysis with the focal object being the I, and the aspect being inherent existence, I can come to the conclusion that it cannot be found. And that is emptiness. And that emptiness here is based on the I. There's no emptiness in space. In this case, it's based on the I. Does that make sense? All right. You raised your hand in the very back. Was that just a...
Yes, I was just wondering, maybe I was wondering, but you say, do we need a focal object in order to realize emptiness? Or emptiness, does emptiness have to have a focal object to be realized?
I don't get the question.
No, like you say, to realize emptiness, you have to have an object.
Uh-huh. If you realize emptiness, you have a focal object.
Yes.
The emptiness of something that exists. An existent object. Okay? You take an existent object. You're not interested in the emptiness of the horns of a rabbit. You take an existent object, the eye or a table, and then analyze, can it exist the way it appears? How does it appear to me as if existing in and of itself? That is the aspect you now analyze. Does that help?
Yes.
So that becomes your aspect. The focal object is the person, is the table, etc.
It can be a concept as well.
A concept? What do you mean with a concept?
Well, the focal object can be a concept as well.
What is a concept?
Love.
Love is not a concept.
The concept.
Love is a state of mind. It's a mind.
But there
Love?
is the concept of love that has a definition.
That is the idea of love, but the idea of love is not love. Right?
Right.
So, how do you analyze the... Are you saying you're analyzing love or the idea of love?
Are you trying to realize the emptiness of love, for example?
Okay.
Yes.
So, in that case, now I understand your question. So, you're analyzing the emptiness of the mind, such as the mind of love. Yes. Someone asked this question, what is the emptiness of the mind? And I haven't really gotten into that yet. Yes, you can take any object and realize, and I come to understand that it doesn't exist inherently. Okay? But there's no emptiness that exists independent of any object. All right. Anyway, sorry, this was now going back to this here. All right. Similarity of time. The similarity of time refers to the main mind and its mental factors arising, remaining, and ceasing simultaneously. So arising, abiding, and ceasing simultaneously. So it means that they arise at the same time. The main mind and its mental factors, they arise together. For instance, a main mind that is an ear consciousness apprehending the sound of water arises, abides, that is, remains for some time, and then ceases at the same time as its concomitant mental factors that also apprehend the sound of water. And then the similarity of substantial entity, which is just a weird way of saying they're of one nature. So it refers to one mind having only one of each type of a mental factor, and also that they're of one entity. This is not mentioned here, but it's usually understood to be the case. So therefore, a main mind that is a nose consciousness that apprehends perfume, for instance, is concomitant only with one type of the mental factor of feeling, or the one mental factor of discrimination, and so forth. Those are different mental factors. So just to repeat what I said with these similarities, okay? Number one, they arise from the same cause. Number two, they have the same object. Number three, they arise all together. And number four, they are part and parcel, and each part and parcel, each package of main minds and mental factors only ever has just one main mind, and one of each of the... So you cannot have two types of feelings. Can't have two feelings at the same time. Two different functions, in other words. So you only have just one function at a time. So there's no contradicting function. So feeling pleasant feeling and unpleasant. You can't have both. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. As mentioned above, there are 51 mental factors that are divided into 6 categories. Omnipresent mental factors, 5 object ascertaining mental factors, 11 virtuous mental factors, root afflictions, 20 secondary, 4 changeable. Okay, so omnipresent, some people say that's not a good translation. It is usually, it's very commonly used, the omnipresent ones, they're always there. Some say the all-accompanying. It's a better word. They all accompany everyone. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know why they feel so strongly about it, but I remember someone discussing this. Anyway, I use the 5 omnipresent. Some people say all accompanying. The 5 omnipresent mental factors, that's basically just saying they're always there. Every mind has those functions, and they may not always be actively there, but the function to some degree is always there. To some degree. It may be weak, it may be stronger, but it's still there. Which is contact, discrimination or discernment, feeling, intention, and attention or mental engagement. So, in other words, a mind always makes contact with an object. Okay? Contact, it sounds so bizarre. It's almost like, let's call him up and kind of make contact. The word is rekbar, as in like you get in touch with something. You contact as in like getting in touch with something. So a mind always has an object, so it connects with an object, right? So again, this very weird Tibetan vocabulary, which on first hearing it is bizarre, but you hear it over and over again, and after a while you get used to it. We can come up with a new word, of course, but it's more like connecting. It's more like connecting with something, right? So contact just means the mind's ability to perceive something, which means you have to connect to something to perceive it. Would you agree? Does that make sense? To kind of connect to something to have contact. All right. So contact is a mental factor that contacts or meets the object of awareness, kind of connects with it. For instance, in order for an I consciousness apprehending a vase to arise, the I consciousness must make contact with the vase. You see, when I speak, I say it slightly differently than in this text. I do this on purpose because there are the Tibetan scriptures, and I don't want to go off too much. I don't know how far, because these mind and mental factors, there's not that much explanation on them. There's not that extensive explanation where words are used slightly differently. So to use the source text and not to lose that source text, I'm pretty strict with the vocabulary I use. With other explanations, I'm much looser. Like previously, it was much more of a vocabulary that we can connect to. So in what I write, it sounds odd, but just when I speak, I may use different words, right? So to connect with an object, for instance, that's contact. All right. That is simple. That's just this ability of the mind to connect to an object. The next one is discernment or discrimination. Whichever you want to use, discrimination. I chose this translation here, which is more common. Is a mental function or mental factor that discerns its object. It is aware of the object's specific characteristics and thereby able to distinguish it from other objects. Now, without perceiving those, it's in like analyzing them, that doesn't take place. But still, there's a basic awareness. If I know table, I must know what is not table, right? I should be able to, because otherwise, how can I know table, especially with the I consciousness looking in this area? And I can focus on just table. My mind is able to do that because it's able to discern between that which is not table, right? Which area do I focus on? I want to see, I kind of scan the room, and I kind of, as part of my scanning the room, I perceive the table. Now I kind of know what is the table and what is not the table, because that allows me now to, after I scan the room, to focus on that table. Right? Eye consciousness focuses on a particular object. It can only do that because it can discern between the different characteristics that make up the table and those that don't. Am I making sense? And you don't need much analysis. You don't need, like, we have a sense that requires some thoughts, etc. Well, yeah, a mental consciousness must have been there before that learned what is a table, what distinguishes a table. All this happened at some point on the level of a mental consciousness, because a newborn child won't be able to perceive a table initially. Okay? I don't think that ability carries on from one life to the next. Certain abilities carry on, but this is too complicated. Like, we're not aware of what a table is initially. Therefore, it's the mental consciousness that goes through a process of understanding and then influences our sense perception. In that case, our discernment is affected also by our understanding of the table. Therefore, our eye consciousness can discern. Okay? Very, very basic discernment only. Very, very basic, but enough for the eye consciousness to recognize. Okay? Does that make sense? And discern is a very strong word. One thing you may actually notice in Buddhism. We use these words, blanket terms or general terms, that seem to suggest something very strong. We use the word suffering. We use the word anger as a blanket term to even describe resentment or dislike. Right? That is done purposely to say anger can have weaker forms, basically. So we may not in everyday life call that anger, but it's a form of. It acts similar to full-blown anger. Or suffering. This is what people get upset about, a little bit about Buddhism. They're like, Buddhism is all about suffering, suffering, suffering. It is not suffering in the traditional sense. It's just a form of, it's a type of feeling that in comparison to what our mind can feel is a miserable state of mind. So we just call it suffering. But of course there's so many different degrees. So this is very common in Buddhism, that you use all the different scales of a specific emotions and give it the name of the strongest of those. So call it anger. This morning I was thinking, I don't know how it came up, I was just thinking of someone, and I caught myself thinking of just negative qualities of that person. I wasn't angry with that person. No one you know, so no one. No one here, no one you know. Someone. Anyway, and I thought, oh, there you go, anger, right away. I'm exaggerating, I'm not thinking of the positive qualities. I only focus on the negative qualities, and I could feel a sense of dislike. Okay? And I thought, oh, so interesting. I wouldn't call that anger. I'm not even sure I would call it resentment, because I don't exactly resent that person. I don't even know that person, to be honest. But there's just one aspect I know about this person, the only thing I've heard about them, and there's a sense of dislike. That's actually, in the Buddhist context, it's a form of anger, except in everyday life we wouldn't call it that. It's just a very weak version of just focusing on the negative quality and not being able to see anything else. So even the case of dislike is part of that, right? So just understand how the vocabulary is used. I'm not saying I'm totally angry with that person. That would be ridiculous. I don't even know this person. But just a sense of not being able to consider a positive quality in that moment. And just seeing that negativity, that's a form of anger in the way it's defined. Suffering is similar. So not everything is suffering in the everyday life we experience, but we have very limited experiences that in comparison to the peace and inner satisfaction of nirvana, this could be called a suffering. Am I making sense? Now, here with regard to discernment again, it seems like discernment means like I'm discriminating. It's this, it's that. I put things here and I put things there. It seems to suggest that. But it's a very, very subtle and very subtle aspect of just being able to know this from that. Okay? And I use again the strongest term that suggests the strongest aspect of it to describe the entire spectrum. So actually with anger we mean a huge spectrum. With discernment we mean a huge spectrum. So for those who are already aware of that, they've already, definitely they know about it. But for those not, please be aware, here discernment means something very specific. Then there's feeling. The same applies to feeling. There are so many different types of feeling. Here it is not like, oh, I feel so exuberated or I feel so depressed. You don't have that kind of feeling with an eye consciousness, for instance. So feeling is just in general a mental factor that experiences the object, of course the mind always has an object, as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. Neither pleasant or unpleasant, which is another way of saying neutral. So sometimes we say, I don't feel anything. Well, that's a neutral feeling. You do feel a neutral feeling. So actually in English we don't really say you feel something when it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. But there is another, that is seen as a form of form of feeling, except it's called neutral. It is impossible to apprehend an object without the presence of any of the three types of feeling: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. In fact, feeling is the element that drives us. So even with a mental consciousness, with food, so the fact that we can actually feel a pleasant feeling with food accounts for the fact that explains, for instance, that some people lose their ability to taste food. Have you heard of those people? The food is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, it's neutral. And people don't want to eat any longer. They're really upset that either they use their ability to smell, which affects, of course, their taste too, or just altogether there's no longer any perception of taste. And then you no longer want to eat. How can you have attachment for food? It sounds bizarre right now. It's almost like, no, I'm attached for other reasons. No, you're not. Of course, you fill your stomach, but then you might as well eat anything. To fill your stomach, right? Anything in the sense, of course, if it makes you sick, you may not eat it. But even foods that previously you thought were boring. I mean, you could just eat vegetables without salt, right? Stop eating salt. Stop eating, things that we don't necessarily need to eat. Because it's just about filling your stomach. but you use your attachment. So therefore there's a feeling there. It's not just conceptual. The conceptual mind then, of course, it goes further than, whoa, this fruit is so great, I'm not going to go to class because I have that. Never mind those 5 minutes. Anyway, so that's the conceptual mind. No, but the sense consciousness, just pleasure. Okay? So definitely experiences pleasure or displeasure in case it's the type of fruit we don't like. And the mental consciousness, of course, influences it. If it looks disgusting, right? It could be just as terribly delicious, but it dampens that experience, right? I mean, if I feel grossed out, I can't eat something. So I guess we feel similar in the same way. But that's the mental consciousness kind of influencing it. In fact, it's the element that drives us. Feeling drives us. It is responsible for the majority of our physical, verbal, and mental actions. The reason for this is that pleasant feeling induces attachment, unpleasant feeling induces anger, and neutral feeling induces ignorance. Ignorance here in the sense of an indifference. Okay? Alright, then there's intention or volition. Intention is not a good word, but it is used. Intention is much, much coarser. That seems like volition, it seems like motivation. And that is, it's too coarse to actually use it. I prefer the word volition, but a lot of people use the word intention. So I put here both, in order for you not to get confused. Intention is often used interchangeably with motivation. We should have a positive motivation to come to the teaching. So positive intention. That is the conceptual mind conjuring up. That is with an effort, and it's involved with an effort to generate the wish to do something. That's conceptual. But here we're talking about even the I consciousness having volition, having the aspect of volition. So here volition, intention, just because it's more widely used, I use that, but volition is a mental factor that moves or directs the awareness to the object. It directs the mind. It is that which directs the mind. So of course when it's a conceptual mind, it can direct the mind towards virtue. Right? Consciously taking on the object of virtue. That then turns it into an actual motivation. But even with the sense consciousness, moving to an object, moving around to different objects, that's volition. It's that ability of the mind, is that function of the mind to move to objects. Right? That's called volition. Does that make sense? So its basic factor, it just moves from one object to the next. Like, for instance, if you like something, if there's a pleasant feeling, then your mental mental consciousness wants the sense consciousness to move to a different object, right? It has that intention. Let's put something else in your mouth, etc. But then it can actually move to a different object, kind of like paying more attention to a different object. If you have different things in your mouth, for instance, or you look at a whole variety of things on the wall, paying attention to a particular object more than to something else. That is possible because of volition. Right? Moving to a different object. And then, of course, attention or mental engagement. Attention or mental engagement is a mental factor. In Tibetan, it's actually yin-jung, which just means mental engagement. It's a mental factor whose main object is to enable the concomitant mind and the other mental factors to remain on the object. Really, it's kind of attention. You stay with the object for some time without changing. Right? Does that make sense? You're able to remain on an object for some time. It prevents the awareness from moving away from the object and serves as a basis for concentration and mindfulness. Attention also focuses on a specific object or a specific aspect of the object, filtering out other objects. So the mental consciousness, even the sense consciousness can do that, but in a very, very, very basic way. It's really basic, right? So the sense consciousness is all in the sphere of vision, but you pay more attention to one thing or another. Does that make sense? And the volition is able to change. It enables you to change the object, but the attention is like keeping the mind on the object. And for you to know something, you need to keep on an object for some time. If I just do this, right? Your attention may be there, but because the object moves so fast, your attention cannot hold something because it needs a few seconds or whatever the time that would make up, or that would be, for the mind to actually notice something, right? Does that make sense? So in that moment it becomes, with regard to this piece of paper, awareness to which the object appears but is not ascertained, because the object moving too quickly. Does that make sense? So your attention may be there, but if your attention is not there, if it's too weak, then it becomes an awareness to which the object appears but is not ascertained. In general, you see, when your attention, the attention of your eye consciousness is very strong, then naturally the attention of your other sense consciousnesses, they weaken, and they're no longer sufficient for the other sense consciousnesses to know, that is, to realize their objects. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Alright, just to understand, what's the difference between attention and the concentration then?
Attention and concentration. Concentration is a mental consciousness which uses this function of the mind, that ability to pay attention of the mind, and takes it further. Okay? So every mind has a certain degree of attention, but not every mind is concentrated. You wouldn't say the eye consciousness is concentrated. Concentration means the ability of the mind to just stay on an object, right? And an eye consciousness, it's of course influenced by the mental consciousness, right? The mental consciousness determines basically how long you stay on an object. But the sense consciousness must have that ability to follow the instructions of the mental consciousness, right? And then the focus is a lot more the mental consciousness. That really stays like concentrated. So just that ability to concentrate, to keep that object, that has nothing to do with the object keeping appearing generally. It's like the object is not there. To the mental consciousness, there's no external object appearing. You have to bring up the object. Does that make sense? The mind itself has to make much more of an effort to bring up the object, because it's not reflected in the same way as in like it's right in front of you. Okay? So concentration means not only do you pay attention, you now need to make an effort to focus for some time. It requires a certain degree of effort on our part. For the attention, that effort is not required. It's just an ability of the mind to stay with an object for some time. Here, the concentration is more involved with an effort that comes from a mental consciousness remaining with the object. And that effort can lead you to practice concentration such that you can concentrate for longer. And it's kind of training. It's a kind of training that requires effort. So small children, if they watch a lot of TV where there are a lot of imaging one after the other, so like a lot of they're exposed to a lot of quick changes, they don't learn that ability to remain with one object, right? So then they end up with ADHD and ADHD, you know that, right? ADHD. Yeah. So that kind of problem. But of course, we all have it to some. I don't know whether that's the main cause of it. Who's to say? But it could be a cause for a child suffering from ADHD. There could be other causes, of course, too. So therefore, it actually just means also these children have concentration. Even a child with ADHD has a certain degree of concentration. But it may not be as long as for other children. So everyone has concentration. Everyone has that ability to concentrate. And they may concentrate on things that they really like for a long period of time. It's just school is boring, so they don't concentrate on certain things they're taught. Right? Anyway, but it requires some effort. And even though we have it naturally, it still requires an effort. Does that make sense?
Should I wait for later for questions?
Pardon? If you don't mind?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just check. We're 44 now. We started 41. I want to go to 50 today. Well, maybe that's not even necessary. All right. We can open it questions now. So we have 15 minutes of questions. Yeah?
I've got one question, but firstly, I just want to say something. ADHD, it's like a lot of evidence stays related to childhood stress now. So, you can check out.
But watching a movie can be very stressful.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
Right? Stress doesn't have to be an adult stress. I think just exposing children to a lot of imagery, a childhood trauma. But even watching a lot of TV what is on TV can be very traumatic. It's not the same. Well, I don't know. I mean, but look, I know plenty of Tibetan children who suffer from that. There's no, I mean, I don't know how many traumas. Yeah, there's so many causes. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, sorry, I'm going to disagree, but I don't know whether it's probably in most cases it is stress, but I think it could be other things as well. Yeah. Anyway.
Question
yeah.
is: to what extent is the attention of volition influence, or the result of feeling?
To what extent is
the attention of volition influenced,
by
or the result of feeling?
Of feeling. Well, it is. You see, the thing is, like, the function is always there to some degree, but especially when it comes to the mental consciousness, in that case, it's absolutely that a feeling. For instance, you don't feel happy to think about an object, so then your volition changes the object, like very quickly, I don't want to think about it, right? When there's this conscious thought, oh, I don't want to think about it, and you change, that is only possible because you have volition. And that was triggered by this unpleasant feeling. While if it's a pleasant feeling, you want more of it. So yes.
So and that's completely under the sway of feelings.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Pretty much. Not for everyone. Not for everyone. It depends on the person. Some people are more attached to feeling, and others are less attached. For instance, when you do certain sports, right? Certain feelings, you welcome them, although you would initially, someone else would call them unpleasant, but you deal with them, that is, your mental consciousness is able to override them and regard them as something positive and get you through that feeling.
So what is that part of the mind that can overcome the feeling?
Override, as in like,
is that
not...
volition or discrimination?
So which mental factor is responsible for that? Well, I guess... You see, those are just so basic, and you need a little bit more than those. But I guess volition could also be keeping the mind on the object, deciding, kind of, or being a factor that enables you to decide to remain with the object. Attention there needs to be there too. So you need, like, when there's a negative emotion coming up, and sometimes we just push it away. We don't want to watch it. Versus then, there's a mental consciousness in between going, no, it's important for me to watch it, I'll just watch it. So I guess it's also attention, volition, making contact, all of those in a way, right, play into it. Or the feeling like, in a sense also of understanding it's important, not feelings like pleasant, unpleasant, or even pleasant feeling, like comes from a sense like a pleasant feeling that is the result from this is important. You see, like, feeling is very important in Buddhist practice. If you do a practice, you need to generate a feeling of pleasure at some point or another. If you don't, for instance, if you meditate and there's so much displeasure, and you allow that displeasure to remain, you will never meditate again. You can't. So you may have had these explanations where they say, don't meditate too long for the first time, because in a Lamrim, for instance, in some of the Lamrim texts, it says, otherwise you look at the medication cushion, you want to throw up. It really literally says that. So it's really interesting. It's kind of saying, you need to find some pleasure. So even when there's an unpleasant feeling, if you just allow for that unpleasant feeling to just override it, in the sense to ignore it, but you have no pleasant feeling, it's not going to work. So you must have a pleasant feeling, having a feeling of pleasure, that the pleasure of dealing with your own deep fears, etc. Right? Like seeing the important, like maybe you've been able to do it at some point, you feel like, yes, I've done it, I've dealt with that, that's out of the way. That pleasurable feeling enables you now to even endure the unpleasant feeling. But you see, it's not like just unpleasant feeling, because if there was no pleasant feeling, you couldn't do it. Pleasant feeling is considered very important in Buddhism. It may seem like, well, we're accepting suffering, etc., but only for the sake of allowing that to give rise to a pleasant feeling. So a pleasant feeling needs to be there. So in fact, like in answer to your question, all of them are involved. Yeah. All of them are involved. All important. Yeah. So it's hard for me to say it's only that, but there may be one predominant in a different case.
Could you also compare these 5 to the aggregates?
Aggregates. Do I compare them? Can I compare them? No, they're very different. Just they happen to be 5. Yeah, the only similarity is that there are 5. I don't think there's any similarity.
It's like you've got fear.
Oh, sorry. Oh, in that sense. Oh, now I get what you mean. Yeah. So we do take 2 out of the 5. We take 2 out: feeling and discernment. Okay. So now the question is why. The question is why, right? You're right. Other than that, I wouldn't say only that 2. There just happen to be 2 of them are part of the 5 aggregates. Actually, the aggregates, the easiest way to think of the aggregates is as 2. Mind and body. Right? And then you have some extra. You have mind and body plus, what is the one, like the compositional factor, right? That you need because we are not just made of mind and body, we also have imprints, for instance, to include those. And then they chose to use feeling and indiscrimination as separately. Why? I could make that your homework. Or as discussion. Why are feeling and discernment, you could have actually just 3 aggregates, mind and body, and the potentials, for instance, seeds, imprints that are neither mind nor body, and so they're a separate category. You can have those 3. And then we add, so randomly, of all the 51 mental factors, feeling and discernment. Where does that come from? That's actually, then you understand the 5 aggregates thoroughly. If you really understand that one, then it makes more sense. So that's part of the discussion. Great. I think maybe you were after him. Yes, go ahead. Yes, please.
Okay, so from a Buddhist point of view, what is the relation between hormones and feelings and how they influence each other?
Hormones. It's very interesting. Very strong relationship, I believe. I believe that hormones lead to certain feelings on the level of the sense consciousnesses, and that unpleasant or what have you, and that gives rise to, this is what is explained in the Pramanavartika, Dharmakitri's Pramanavartika. He says that physical aspects in the body don't directly affect the mental consciousness, but they affect the sense consciousnesses. So, for instance, hormone may lead to fear. You feel fearful, or may restlessness, or it may lead to different experiences that we associate with the mental consciousness, or may you feel irritated, as an example. But there's first, on a physical level, like if the sense consciousnesses, they react. The sense powers are affected. That gives rise to a certain sense perception, and if we find that if that's unusual, we may get fearful, like this, there's an emotion that's, right? Fear is very interesting. Fear can have many, many causes, and I'll address this, because in the 21st century we experience a lot of fear. So I'll just, not in relation to your question, but just saying that. So it could be because suddenly there's an experience you never had before, and you're fearful of that. Fear of the unknown. That could be an example. When you take drugs, let's say someone gives you, I thought about this is the most horrific thing, to give someone magic mushrooms without them knowing. Right? Give it to a nun or a monk. Oh my God. Or like one of those little things they could trip or something. They don't know. And fear could arise because these drugs have no influence on the mental consciousness directly, but on the sense powers. They lead to certain sense consciousnesses, which can lead to great confusion or great pleasure. If there's a great pleasure that is as part of the physical, or you see colors and shapes, etc. But from a Buddhist point of view, hormones affect the sense consciousnesses, so they affect the feeling. I would say mainly the feeling, but maybe also they hamper the ability to discern. They hamper the ability to pay attention. They hamper the ability of volition to change from an object, right? Like just the mind acts or differently. I don't know.
Mental consciousness handle the disbalance of hormones?
it always, like, according to Dharmakitri, he's very big on that in the Pramanavartika, it's always through the sense consciousnesses. So there's no direct effect on the mental consciousness. It is through the sense consciousnesses being affected, and they then induce mental consciousnesses. Like even a sleeping pill. A sleeping pill gives rise to a sleeping mind because the sense consciousnesses, they're no longer working. When you take a sleeping pill, your sense basis is affected in such a way that for some time your sense consciousnesses cannot work. If they do not work, then that means no coarse mind can arise, and so the mind automatically grows subtler, which translates into sleeping. I don't even know whether you fall asleep or you actually just fall unconscious, depending on how many sleeping pills you take. It's like, whoop, whoop, gone, right? So, so I think it's really, again, it's not that your mental consciousness is affected by the sleeping pill, it affects your sense consciousnesses, and via those sense consciousnesses, them no longer being active, you automatically have a subtle mind. Okay? So, needs to be analyzed, but it makes a lot of sense to me. So it's always indirectly.
Like just something to that.
Just something to that? Is there anyone else who has something to that? No.
Does the mental consciousness affect the release of hormones?
Does the mental consciousness affect the release of hormones? I would say yes. I thought you said it the other way around, as in like the hormones being the cause of the mental consciousness.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the same.
Sorry. Then it's the mental consciousness can serve as the cause of the sense consciousnesses. Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally believe in that. Yes. Yes. Yes?
So I'm interested in knowing how do you decide what criterion or criteria to use, to employ, in determining whether or not something inherently exists? What is the justification that can be given for using a certain criterion for deciding this, whether or not something inherently exists?
Whether it exists independently.
As against some other criterion. Because Buddhism uses the criterion of whether or not that thing is dependent on other things for its existence.
Yes. Dependent or not dependent. Yeah. So that's it. That's a criterion. Mm-hmm.
If you go to a scientist, science uses very different criteria. They both arrive at the same conclusion, but the criteria used are very different.
No, I don't think it's very different. I think the words are just different that they use. I'm not sure they use a different criteria.
I can tell you the criteria they use. So the criteria they use is insofar as the thing is discernible, is distinguishable from all other things in the world, that thing would be said to possess individuality, self-identity, and so on. So if it could not be distinguished, if it is indiscernible from every other thing in the world, then it would be said to not possess identity, self-identity and individuality.
No, but that's, but in Buddhism that is not a criterion for inherent existence or not. I don't...
Causal dependence is a criterion.
No, I think that's different. I'm not even sure science talks about lack of inherent existence, etc. I mean, maybe they address it in some way, but I don't think they say that phenomena don't exist in and of themselves. Otherwise, I'm not sure they could account for existence in the first place. So, unfortunately, your question can only be answered if you do a whole course on emptiness, right? Because it's really like saying, what is the criterion for it? Like, now we need to talk about the object of negation, why it cannot exist. I think I've mentioned that many times before, and I was hoping this is clear, but obviously it's not really totally clear. So everything I've said so far was actually, in regard to emptiness, I was trying to set forth a criterion for what would it mean if something existed inherently and why it cannot exist inherently. But definitely I realize that there's more to be done. And please just bear with me. Every time it comes up, I'll address it again. But I don't think I can answer this in a few words now. And like I said, I don't think when science talks about inherent existence and interdependence, it means the same thing. I don't think science would say the phenomena are merely labeled, as in like that deepest level of interdependence. And I don't think they would say something is not inherent in an object. And again, we need to use the word, of course, in a specific context. Still we can say wetness is inherent in water, but that's not inherent existence as it is described in Buddhism. It's slightly different.
Okay, lunch.
I know, it's really lunch. Sorry, so Tim, Sam, what's your name? Yuval? Tuval, Sam, Tim, Desi, Inat? No? Okay, alright, you are the ones after the break. We start with the class, and then we have a little bit longer, 40 minutes of question and answer, so during that time you'll be the first one. Please leave quickly, because I've already stretched it 4 minutes.